Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I remember it vividly. Every last detail of that day is still etched into my mind, as if I'm replaying a bad film reel that I can't turn off. It's been years since it happened, but the memory hasn't faded one bit. The cabin, the isolation, and the terror. It all feels too fresh, too real, even now. It was late September 2019 when my wife Grace and I decided to take a much-needed vacation. I had been working as a park ranger at Shenandoah National Park for over a decade, and the job had begun to take its toll. The constant stream of tourists, the never-ending maintenance, and the occasional search and rescue operations had left me mentally and physically exhausted. I craved the quiet that only true isolation could provide, a place where I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. We had saved up for months to rent a little cabin near a place called Raven's Hollow, deep in the Appalachian foothills of Virginia. It was so remote that it didn't even show up on most maps. The rental listing had promised ultimate seclusion and a chance to reconnect with nature, which sounded perfect to us. We'd been married for 12 years, and this was our first real escape from the grind of daily life. The drive to the cabin was an adventure in itself. We left our home in Harrisonburg early in the morning, our old Subaru packed to the brim with supplies. As we drove further into the mountains, the roads became narrower and more winding. The GPS signal flickered in and out, and more than once I had to consult the paper map we'd brought as a backup. It was late afternoon by the time we turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The air grew cooler and damper as we climbed higher into the mountains. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Grace asked, peering out the window at the dense forest. Her voice held a mix of excitement and apprehension. I nodded, trying to project confidence. The owner said it would feel like we're going the wrong way, but to just keep following this road. It should dead end right at the cabin. As if on cue, the trees suddenly parted, revealing a small clearing, and there it was, our home for the next 2 weeks. The cabin was old but sturdy-looking, its weathered logs silvered with age. A small porch jutted out from the front, complete with a couple of rocking chairs that looked like they'd seen better days. I parked the car and we both sat there for a moment, taking it in. The silence was profound. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional bird call. "It's beautiful," Grace murmured, a smile spreading across her face. We got out of the car, stretching our legs after the long drive. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath, feeling some of the tension from the past few months start to ebb away. As we unloaded our supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking at the edge of the clearing. But there was nothing there, just the endless sea of trees. "You okay?" Grace asked, noticing my distraction. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just taking it all in. It's been a while since I've been somewhere this remote." We carried our bags inside, and I have to admit I was impressed. The interior of the cabin was rustic but clean and well-maintained. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a worn but comfortable-looking sofa facing it. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old gas stove and a refrigerator that hummed softly. There was only one bedroom, tucked away at the back of the cabin. The bed was covered in a patchwork quilt that looked handmade, and a small window overlooked the dense forest behind the cabin. As Grace started unpacking, I went back outside to bring in the rest of our supplies. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. As I reached into the car for the last bag, a sound caught my attention. It was faint, barely audible over the rustle of leaves, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded like whispers, multiple voices speaking in hushed tones just at the edge of hearing. I straightened up, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing to see. The sound faded away as quickly as it had come, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined it. I shook my head, trying to clear away the unease that had settled over me. It was just the wind in the trees, I told myself, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me after the long drive. Back inside, I found Grace in the kitchen, unpacking the groceries we'd brought. "This place is perfect," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I can't believe how quiet it is out here." I nodded, not wanting to mention the whispers I thought I'd heard. There was no need to worry her, especially not on our first night here. Instead, I wrapped my arms around her from behind, resting my chin on her shoulder. "I'm glad you like it," I said. "I think this is exactly what we needed." As the last light faded from the sky, we settled in for our first night in the cabin. We lit a fire in the fireplace, its warm glow chasing away the chill that had crept in with the darkness. We talked about nothing and everything, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company without the usual distractions of modern life. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the trees or the wildlife. Those were familiar to me from my years as a ranger. It was something less tangible, something unsettling. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest and making every breath feel labored. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the warmth of the fire and the comfort of Grace's presence. But as we prepared for bed, I found myself double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. Just a habit from living in the city, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. As we lay in bed that night, the darkness pressing in around us, I strained my ears for any unusual sounds. But there was nothing, just the soft breathing of my wife beside me and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I drifted off to sleep eventually, but my dreams were uneasy, filled with shadowy figures and whispered warnings. Little did I know those dreams were just a taste of the terror that awaited us in the days to come. The first rays of sunlight filtering through the bedroom window woke me the next morning. For a moment I was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a brief surge of panic before I remembered where we were. Grace was still asleep beside me, her face peaceful in the soft morning light. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way to the kitchen. The cabin was cold, the fire having died down to embers during the night. I shivered, pulling on a sweater before starting to make coffee. As the rich aroma of brewing coffee filled the air, I stepped out onto the porch. The morning was crisp and clear, a thin mist clinging to the ground and wreathing the bases of the trees. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. That's when I noticed something odd. The clearing in front of the cabin was empty, just as it had been the night before. But at the edge of the trees, something caught my eye. I squinted, trying to make it out through the mist. It looked like a series of marks in the soft earth, as if something had been dragged from the tree line towards the cabin. My heart rate picked up as I stepped off the porch to investigate. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through my socks as I approached the strange marks. Up close, they were even more unsettling. They were about a foot wide, the grass and undergrowth pressed flat in long, straight lines. They led from the edge of the forest straight to the porch steps where they abruptly ended. I knelt down, examining the marks more closely. There was no sign of whatever had made them, no footprints or other disturbances in the surrounding area. It was as if something had appeared at the edge of the forest, dragged itself to our door, and then vanished. "What are you looking at?" Grace's voice made me jump. I stood up quickly, trying to compose myself. "Oh, just checking out the clearing," I lied, not wanting to worry her. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. "Like a log. This place is so quiet, it's amazing." I forced a smile, following her back into the cabin. As I closed the door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin. There was a small trail that led deeper into the woods, winding its way through towering oaks and pines. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, but something felt off. The wildlife seemed wary. More than once I caught a glimpse of a deer or a fox, only for it to freeze and then bolt at our approach. "They're not used to people out here," I explained to Grace when she commented on it. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know how animals typically behaved around humans. This was different. They weren't just cautious, they were terrified. As we walked, I kept an eye out for any signs of other people. But there was nothing, no litter, no worn paths, not even an old fire pit. It was as if we were the first humans to set foot in these woods in years. We returned to the cabin in the early afternoon. Grace suggested we relax on the porch with some books, and I agreed, grateful for the chance to sit and gather my thoughts. But as I settled into one of the old rocking chairs, movement at the edge of my vision made me tense. I turned my head slowly, trying to catch whatever it was in my direct line of sight. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a tall, dark shape standing just beyond the tree line, but when I blinked, it was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked Grace, my voice tighter than I intended. She looked up from her book, brow furrowed. "See what?" I hesitated, not sure how to explain what I thought I'd seen. Nothing, I guess. Must have been a shadow. But I knew it wasn't a shadow. Shadows don't move on their own, and they certainly don't have eyes that gleam with an unnatural light. As the day wore on, more strange occurrences piled up. Small things easily explained away, but unsettling in their frequency. The wind chime on the porch would ring despite there being no breeze. Objects we'd left in one place would turn up in another, and always that feeling of being watched. By the time evening fell, I was on edge. I suggested we stay inside for the night, citing the chill in the air. Grace agreed readily enough, but I could tell she was picking up on my unease. We made dinner together, the mundane task of chopping vegetables and stirring pots helping to calm my nerves. But as we sat down to eat, a sound from outside made us both freeze. It was a long, low moan, almost like the wind, but there was something distinctly vocal about it. It rose and fell in pitch, echoing through the trees before fading away. "What was that?" Grace whispered, her fork halfway to her mouth. I stood up slowly, moving to the window. The clearing was dark, the trees beyond it a solid wall of blackness. "Probably just the wind," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. We finished our meal in silence, the cozy atmosphere of earlier in the day completely evaporated. As we cleaned up, I noticed Grace's hands were shaking slightly as she dried the dishes. "Are you okay?" I asked, reaching out to touch her arm. She nodded, but her smile was strained. "Just a little jumpy, I guess. It's so different out here compared to the city." I pulled her into a hug, feeling her relax slightly against me. "It'll take some getting used to," I said. "But we're safe here, I promise." Even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. There was something wrong about this place, something that went beyond the normal unease of being in an unfamiliar environment. But I pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on comforting my wife. We spent the rest of the evening in the living room, the TV tuned to an old movie we'd seen a dozen times before. The familiar dialogue and predictable plot were soothing, helping to ease some of the tension that had built up over the day. But as we prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. I double-checked all the locks, drew the curtains tight, and even wedged a chair under the doorknob of our bedroom door. Grace raised an eyebrow at this last action but didn't comment. I think she was as unsettled as I was, even if she didn't want to admit it. As we lay in bed that night, the darkness pressing in around us, I strained my ears for any unusual sounds. For a long time there was nothing but the soft sound of Grace's breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from the wall right beside our bed. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder and more insistent with each passing second. I sat up, my heart pounding. Grace stirred beside me, mumbling sleepily. "What's wrong?" "Shh," I whispered, holding up a hand for silence. The scratching continued, moving slowly along the wall towards the window. I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table, my hand shaking slightly as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the wall, but there was nothing there. No marks, no movement, nothing to explain the sound we'd both clearly heard. As suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, heavy with anticipation and fear. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves outside had us on edge. By the time dawn finally broke, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed. Little did we know, this was just the beginning. The true horrors that awaited us in that isolated cabin were beyond anything we could have imagined. The next day dawned overcast and gloomy, matching our moods perfectly. Grace and I moved around the cabin like ghosts, exhausted from our sleepless night and jumpy at the slightest sound. We barely spoke, each lost in our own thoughts about the strange occurrences of the previous day and night. As I made coffee, I caught Grace staring out the window, her brow furrowed in concern. "What is it?" I asked, coming to stand beside her. She pointed to the edge of the clearing. "Those marks you were looking at yesterday, they're gone." I followed her gaze, my stomach dropping as I realized she was right. The strange drag marks I'd seen in the morning dew were nowhere to be seen. The grass stood tall and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever touched it. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," I suggested weakly, not believing it myself. Grace turned to me, her eyes searching my face. "What's really going on here, James? You've been on edge since we arrived." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know. Something just feels off about this place, but it's probably nothing, just my imagination running wild." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue either. We spent the day trying to recapture the relaxed vacation mood we'd started with, but our efforts felt forced. We hiked a bit, read on the porch, and even tried to play some card games, but the atmosphere of unease persisted. As evening approached, I suggested we build a campfire in the fire pit behind the cabin. Grace agreed enthusiastically, probably grateful for something to do. We gathered wood and kindling, and soon had a cheerful blaze going. The warmth and light of the fire helped to push back some of the shadows, both literal and figurative, that had been plaguing us. As we sat close together, watching the flames dance, Grace suddenly stiffened beside me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened intently, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the usual night sounds of the forest. "Hear what?" It sounded like singing, very faint, like it was coming from deep in the woods. I strained my ears, but still heard nothing unusual. "I don't hear anything. Are you sure it wasn't just the wind?" She shook her head. "No, it was definitely singing. A woman's voice, I think. It stopped now." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "Let's head inside," I suggested, trying to keep my voice casual. "It's getting late anyway." We doused the fire and hurried back to the cabin. As I locked the door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something. But what? We went through our nightly routine mechanically, both of us on high alert for any strange sounds or sights. As we settled into bed, I found myself dreading the long hours of darkness ahead. I must have dozed off at some point, because I was jolted awake by Grace shaking my shoulder urgently. "James," she hissed, her voice tight with fear, "there's someone outside." I sat up, instantly alert. "What? Where?" "By the porch. I saw a shadow move past the window." I got up quietly, grabbing the heavy flashlight from the bedside table. "Stay here," I whispered to Grace. "I'll check it out." Heart pounding, I crept through the cabin, pausing at each window to peer out into the darkness. When I reached the living room, I saw it. A tall, dark figure standing motionless on the porch, facing the door. My breath caught in my throat. It was unnaturally tall and thin, its proportions all wrong for a human. And it was utterly still, like a statue carved from the night itself. I fumbled for the porch light switch, my hands shaking. The moment before I flipped it, I could have sworn I saw the figure's head begin to turn towards me. Light flooded the porch and nothing. The figure was gone, if it had ever been there at all. I stood there for several long moments, my pulse thundering in my ears. Finally, I forced myself to unlock the door and step outside, flashlight raised like a weapon. The porch was empty, but on the weathered wood of the floorboards, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single, large footprint, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was elongated and oddly jointed, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. I backed into the cabin, slamming and locking the door. Grace was waiting in the hallway, her face pale with fear. "What was it?" she asked. I shook my head, unable to find the words to describe what I'd seen. "We need to leave," I said instead. "First thing in the morning, we're packing up and getting out of here." Grace nodded, relief evident on her face. "I'll start packing now." We spent the rest of the night in tense silence, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. I kept the flashlight close at hand, scanning the windows regularly for any sign of our nighttime visitor. As the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, we breathed a collective sigh of relief. We'd made it through the night. Now all we had to do was leave this place behind and never look back. If only it had been that simple. As we hurriedly packed our belongings, a sound from outside made us both freeze. It was the distinct crunch of tires on gravel, growing steadily louder. We looked at each other in confusion and mounting dread. We weren't expecting anyone. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and we hadn't told anyone exactly where we were staying. I moved to the window, peering out cautiously. What I saw made my heart sink. A large black SUV was pulling into the clearing, its tinted windows revealing nothing about its occupants. "Who is it?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I've got a feeling our troubles are just beginning." As the vehicle came to a stop and its doors began to open, I realized that our isolated cabin in the woods was about to become a lot more crowded, and something told me that whoever these newcomers were, they weren't here to help us. My mind raced as I watched 3 figures emerge from the SUV. They were dressed in dark suits, their movements precise and coordinated. This wasn't some random visit. They were here for a purpose. "Grace," I whispered urgently, "grab only what's essential. We need to leave. Now." She nodded, her face pale but determined. We moved quickly and quietly, stuffing a few clothes and our wallets into a backpack. I grabbed the hunting knife I'd brought along, slipping it into my belt. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. A sharp knock at the door made us both jump. A deep voice called out, "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, we need to speak with you." I put a finger to my lips, motioning for Grace to follow me. We crept towards the back of the cabin, towards the small window in the bathroom. It would be a tight squeeze, but it was our only option. I eased the window open, wincing at every creak. The knocking at the front door became more insistent. "Mr. Holloway, we know you're in there. It's in your best interest to cooperate." I helped Grace through the window first, then squeezed through myself. We dropped to the ground as quietly as possible, crouching low. "Run for the trees," I whispered. "Stay low and don't look back." We made it about halfway across the clearing before I heard a shout from behind us. "They're running! Cut them off!" Abandoning all pretense of stealth, we sprinted for the tree line. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, gaining quickly. Just as we reached the edge of the forest, I felt a hand grab the back of my jacket. I spun around, my fist connecting with the jaw of one of our pursuers. He stumbled back, giving me a moment to shove Grace forward. "Keep going!" I yelled. I turned to face our attackers, determined to buy Grace some time to escape. 2 men were approaching rapidly, while the third was still recovering from my punch. What happened next was a blur of motion and pain. I managed to dodge the first attacker's grab, but the second caught me with a solid blow to the stomach. I doubled over, gasping for air. "Where is it?" one of them demanded, grabbing my hair and yanking my head back. "I don't know what you're talking about," I gasped. The man's face twisted in anger. "Don't play dumb. We know you found it. Where is the artifact?" Before I could respond, a piercing scream cut through the air. Grace's scream. Taking advantage of their momentary distraction, I broke free and ran towards the sound. I found Grace about 50 yards into the forest, struggling against the iron grip of a 4th man, one I hadn't seen before. Without thinking, I charged at him, tackling him to the ground. Grace stumbled away as we rolled across the forest floor, grappling for dominance. He was strong, but I was fueled by desperation and adrenaline. I managed to get on top of him, landing a solid punch to his face, but then I felt something cold press against my temple. "That's enough," a calm voice said. I froze, realizing one of the other men had caught up and was now holding a gun to my head. Slowly, I raised my hands and got to my feet. Grace was being held by another of the men, fear and confusion written across her face. The man I had tackled stood up, wiping blood from his split lip. "You're going to tell us where the artifact is," he said, his voice cold with anger, "or things are going to get very unpleasant for you and your wife." I looked at Grace, saw the terror in her eyes, and made a decision. "All right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll show you where it is. Just don't hurt her." The man with the gun gestured towards the cabin. "After you." As we walked back, my mind was racing. I had no idea what artifact they were talking about, but I knew I had to find a way out of this situation. We entered the cabin, the cozy interior now feeling oppressively small with our captors crowding in behind us. "Well?" the apparent leader said. "Where is it?" I moved towards the fireplace, my mind working furiously. It's hidden in here," I said, kneeling down and pretending to reach into the cold ashes. In one fluid motion, I grabbed the fireplace poker and swung it with all my might. It connected with the leader's knee with a sickening crunch. He went down with a howl of pain. "Run!" I yelled to Grace, using the moment of chaos to make a break for the door. We burst out of the cabin and sprinted for the trees once again. Gunshots rang out behind us, bullets whizzing past and thudding into tree trunks. We ran deeper into the forest, the sounds of pursuit fading behind us. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, a new fear set in. We were lost in a vast, unknown wilderness, being hunted by armed men with no supplies and no plan. As we paused to catch our breath, leaning against a massive oak tree, I looked at Grace. Her face was scratched from branches, her clothes torn, but her eyes were filled with determination. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "We keep moving. We need to find help, or at least a way to contact the outside world." As if in response to my words, a low, inhuman howl echoed through the forest. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with a primal hunger that made my skin crawl. Grace's hand found mine, squeezing tightly. "James," she said, her voice shaking, "what was that?" I shook my head, not wanting to voice the terrifying thoughts running through my mind. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. We need to keep moving." As we set off deeper into the increasingly dark and foreboding forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far worse than what we'd left behind. The men hunting us were a known danger, but whatever was out there in the woods waiting for us, that was something else entirely. Little did we know our ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The forest seemed to close in around us as we pushed deeper into its depths. The towering trees blocked out most of the sunlight, casting everything in an eerie twilight despite it being midday. The air grew thick and humid, clinging to our skin like a damp shroud. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders for signs of pursuit. The sounds of the forest were oppressive. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf could be a threat. The strange howl we'd heard earlier didn't repeat, but its memory hung over us like a dark cloud. "We need to find water," I said softly to Grace as we paused to catch our breath. Her face was pale and drawn, strands of hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. I knew I didn't look much better. She nodded, leaning against a tree for support. "Do you have any idea where we are?" I shook my head. In our panic to escape, we'd run blindly into the woods without any thought of direction. Now every tree looked the same, every path identical. We could have been going in circles for all I knew. "Let's try to head downhill," I suggested. "Water flows downhill, so we might find a stream or river." We set off again, picking our way carefully through the underbrush. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I'd turn to look, there would be nothing there. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally heard the faint sound of running water. Hope surged through me as we quickened our pace, following the sound. We emerged into a small clearing bisected by a narrow stream. The water looked clear and cool, a welcome sight to our parched throats. But as we approached the bank, Grace suddenly grabbed my arm. "James," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Look." I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. On the opposite bank, partially obscured by the undergrowth, was a crude structure. It looked like a shelter of some kind, built from branches and animal hides, but it was the objects hanging from the branches that made my skin crawl. Bones, dozens of them, bleached white by the sun and strung together like macabre wind chimes. "We should go," Grace said, tugging at my arm. "I don't like this." I nodded, but before we could retreat back into the trees, a sound froze us in place. It was a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind us. Slowly, we turned around. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid, but too tall, too thin. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was a mottled gray like the bark of a dead tree, and its face. I'll never forget that face. It was featureless save for a wide, lipless mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth. For a moment everything was still. Then the creature let out a shriek that seemed to pierce right through my skull. It lunged forward with inhuman speed. "Run!" I yelled, shoving Grace ahead of me. We splashed through the stream, scrambling up the opposite bank. I could hear the creature pursuing us, its movements accompanied by the rattling of bones and that terrible shrieking. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The sound of pursuit was always just behind us, never fading, never tiring. Suddenly the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. Grace and I tumbled down a steep slope, rolling and bouncing painfully over rocks and fallen logs. We came to a stop at the bottom, battered and bruised, but alive. I struggled to my feet, helping Grace up. We were in a deep ravine, the sides too steep to climb easily. The only way out seemed to be following the ravine itself. "Are you okay?" I asked Grace, checking her for serious injuries. She nodded, wincing as she touched a cut on her forehead. "I think so. Where's that thing?" We looked back up the slope, but there was no sign of our pursuer. The forest above was eerily silent. "We can't stay here," I said. "Let's follow the ravine, see if we can find a way out." As we made our way along the bottom of the ravine, the walls slowly grew higher around us. The light dimmed and the air grew cooler. An oppressive silence settled over us, broken only by the sound of our labored breathing and cautious footsteps. After what felt like hours, the ravine opened up into a large circular depression, and there, in the center, stood something that made us both gasp. It was a stone structure, ancient and weathered. It looked like a temple of some kind, its architecture unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Symbols and pictographs covered its surface, depicting scenes that made my stomach churn. Human figures bowing before monstrous entities, ritual sacrifices, and transformations that defied natural law. "What is this place?" Grace whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. Before I could answer, a voice spoke from behind us, making us both jump. "This," said the voice, cold and familiar, "is what we've been looking for." We turned to see the men from the cabin standing at the entrance to the ravine, guns trained on us. The leader stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a fanatical light. "Thank you for leading us here," he said. "We couldn't have found it without you." As they advanced towards us, herding us towards the ancient structure, I realized with a sinking feeling that we had escaped one nightmare only to stumble into something far worse. Whatever secrets this temple held, I had a feeling we were about to find out, whether we wanted to or not. The true horror of our situation was only just beginning to unfold, and I feared that our chances of surviving this ordeal were growing slimmer by the minute. The armed men herded Grace and me towards the ancient temple, their guns never wavering. The leader limped slightly, favoring the knee I had struck with the fireplace poker. His eyes burned with a mixture of pain and fanatical excitement as he surveyed the stone structure before us. "Do you have any idea what this is?" he asked, his voice filled with reverence. I shook my head, keeping my body angled to shield Grace as best I could. "Why don't you enlighten us?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This, Mr. Holloway, is the key to unlocking power beyond your wildest imagination, power that will reshape the world as we know it." He gestured for his men to spread out, keeping us contained while he approached the temple entrance. The symbols carved into the stone seemed to writhe in the dim light, creating unsettling optical illusions. "For centuries, my organization has searched for this place," the leader continued. "We knew it was hidden somewhere in these mountains, but its exact location eluded us, until now." Grace's hand found mine, squeezing tightly. I could feel her trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "What organization? Who are you people?" The man turned back to us, his smile growing wider. "We have many names, the enlightened ones, the Keepers of the Veil, but you can call us the Order of the Eternal Shadow." A chill ran down my spine at his words. I'd heard whispers of such groups during my time as a park ranger, cults and secret societies obsessed with the supernatural, but I'd always dismissed them as urban legends and campfire stories. "What do you want from us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "From you, nothing. You were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, but now that you're here—" He trailed off, his gaze becoming calculating. "Well, perhaps you can be of use after all." Before I could respond, a low rumble shook the ground beneath our feet. Dust and small stones rained down from the temple's entrance, and a cold wind began to blow from its dark interior. The leader's eyes widened in excitement. "It's beginning! Quick, bring them inside." We were roughly shoved forward, stumbling into the oppressive darkness of the temple. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that we were in a large, circular chamber. At its center stood a raised dais, upon which rested a stone altar. The walls were covered in more of those unsettling symbols, which seemed to pulse with an inner light. The rumbling grew stronger, and I could hear what sounded like chanting coming from somewhere deep within the temple. The armed men looked nervous, their eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out at them from the shadows. Suddenly, one of the men let out a blood-curdling scream. We all turned to see him being dragged into a dark corner by something I couldn't quite make out. A mass of writhing shadows with too many limbs and glowing red eyes. Chaos erupted. The other men opened fire, their gunshots deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. But their bullets seemed to have no effect on the shadowy creature. It moved with impossible speed, lashing out with tendrils of darkness that left deep smoking gashes in stone and flesh alike. In the confusion, I saw our chance. "Run!" I yelled to Grace, pulling her towards a corridor that led deeper into the temple. We sprinted down the passageway, the sounds of screaming and gunfire fading behind us. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading us ever downward. Strange carvings adorned the walls, depicting scenes of cosmic horror that I tried not to look at too closely. Finally, we emerged into another chamber, smaller than the first but no less ominous. At its center stood a pedestal, upon which rested an object that seemed to absorb the light around it, a small black pyramid covered in glowing red symbols. "The artifact," I whispered, remembering the men's earlier questions. Grace reached out towards it, her eyes glazed over as if in a trance. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her back. "Don't touch it." Her eyes cleared, and she shook her head as if waking from a dream. I don't know what came over me. It was calling to me, James." Before I could respond, a voice spoke from the chamber entrance. "Step away from the artifact." We turned to see the leader of the armed group. He was alone now, his suit torn and bloodied, but his gun was steady as he pointed it at us. "You have no idea what forces you're dealing with," I said, trying to reason with him. "That thing up there, it killed your men. We need to get out of here before—" "Silence!" he roared, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and manic glee. "I've come too far to turn back now. The artifact will be mine, and with it, the power to reshape reality itself." He lunged forward, shoving us aside as he reached for the black pyramid. His fingers closed around it, and for a moment everything was still. Then the screaming began. The leader's body began to twist and contort, his flesh bubbling and reforming as if it were made of wax. The artifact sank into his chest, pulsing with an unholy light. His screams turned to maniacal laughter as he turned to face us, his features now a horrific blend of human and something else. "Run," I whispered to Grace, not daring to take my eyes off the monstrosity before us. "Get out of here. I'll hold him off." "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly, her hand finding mine once again. As the transformed leader advanced towards us, tendrils of shadow writhing around him, I realized that our chances of survival were slim to none. But standing there with Grace, facing the unknown horrors together, I felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever came next, we would face it side by side. And as the chamber filled with an otherworldly light, and the very fabric of reality seemed to warp around us, I knew that our true test was only just beginning. The boundary between our world and something infinitely more terrifying was crumbling, and we were caught in the middle of it all. Our fight for survival had become a battle for the very fate of reality itself. The world exploded into chaos around us. Reality itself seemed to bend and warp, the stone walls of the chamber melting like wax. The transformed leader, if he could still be called that, loomed before us, a writhing mass of shadows and impossible angles. Grace and I clung to each other as the floor beneath our feet began to disintegrate. The leader's laughter, now a horrific blend of human and something utterly alien, echoed through the chamber. "Behold the power of the ancients!" he shrieked, his voice resonating on multiple frequencies at once. "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." As he spoke, tendrils of darkness shot out from his twisted form, wrapping around the crumbling pillars and spreading across the walls. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow with an eerie red light, pulsing in time with the artifact embedded in the leader's chest. I felt a tugging sensation, as if my very being was being pulled in multiple directions at once. Grace's grip on my hand tightened, her nails digging into my skin. "James," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of collapsing stone and reality-bending energies. "What's happening to us?" Before I could answer, a blinding flash of light erupted from the center of the chamber. For a moment I saw everything. Past, present, and future collided in a kaleidoscope of images too fast and too alien for my mind to comprehend. I saw vast, empty spaces between the stars, inhabited by beings of such cosmic horror that my sanity threatened to unravel at the mere glimpse of them. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I found myself lying on the forest floor, gasping for air. Grace was beside me, her eyes wide and unfocused. We were back in the clearing where we'd first encountered the strange shelter made of bones. For a long moment we just lay there, trying to process what had happened. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It seemed impossible that only a day had passed since our ordeal began. Finally, I pushed myself up into a sitting position, wincing at the various aches and pains that made themselves known. "Grace," I said softly, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Are you okay?" She blinked, her gaze slowly focusing on me. I think so. Was it real? Did that all really happen?" I looked down at my hands, noticing for the first time the strange swirling patterns etched into my skin. They looked like the symbols we'd seen in the temple, but they were fading even as I watched, like tattoos disappearing into my flesh. "It was real," I said grimly. "All of it." We slowly got to our feet, surveying our surroundings. The forest seemed different somehow, more vibrant and alive. Colors appeared sharper, and I could hear sounds that I was sure hadn't been there before. Whispers on the wind, the rustling of leaves that sounded almost like words. "We need to get out of here," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "Find help or something." I nodded, but as I turned to leave the clearing, something caught my eye. There, half buried in the soft earth, was a small black object. My heart raced as I knelt down to uncover it. It was a piece of the artifact, a small shard of the Black Pyramid. As I picked it up, I felt a jolt of energy course through my body. Images flashed through my mind. The temple, the transformed leader, and something else. A presence, vast and ancient, stirring from a long slumber. "James?" Grace's worried voice snapped me back to reality. "What is it?" I quickly pocketed the shard, not sure why I felt the need to keep it hidden. "Nothing," I lied. "Just thought I saw something. Let's go." We set off through the forest, trying to find our way back to civilization. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. More than once I caught glimpses of movement in the shadows, gone too quickly to identify. Night fell, and with it came new terrors. Strange lights danced between the trees, leading us off the path. Voices called out to us, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. We pressed on, exhausted and terrified, but determined to survive. As dawn broke, we finally stumbled onto a road. An hour later, a passing truck picked us up, the driver's eyes widening at our battered and wild appearance. We were taken to the nearest hospital, where we were treated for dehydration, minor injuries, and shock. The police came to take our statements, but we quickly realized that telling the truth would only lead to more problems. So we lied, spinning a tale of getting lost in the woods and hallucinating from eating wild mushrooms. They seemed to buy it, or at least pretended to. But as the days passed and we were finally released from the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. The shard of the artifact burned in my pocket, a constant reminder of what we'd experienced. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I could hear it whispering to me, telling me of great and terrible things to come. As Grace and I prepared to return home, I knew that our lives would never be the same. We had glimpsed something beyond the veil of reality, and that knowledge would haunt us forever. The world had changed, or perhaps we had changed. Either way, I feared that the horrors we had faced in those Virginia woods were only the beginning. Something had been set in motion, something ancient and powerful, and as we boarded the plane that would take us home, I couldn't help but wonder, when the time came, would we be ready to face it? The flight home was a blur of exhaustion and lingering fear. Grace slept fitfully beside me, her face twitching with unseen nightmares. I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes, instead staring out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. When we finally arrived home, our apartment felt alien and unfamiliar. The normalcy of it all, the stack of mail on the counter, the wilting plants we'd forgotten to ask someone to water, seemed absurd after what we'd been through. We tried to settle back into our routine, but it was like trying to fit into clothes we'd long outgrown. I returned to my job as a park ranger, but the forests I once found solace in now felt threatening. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow between the trees made me flinch. Grace threw herself into her work, staying late at the office and bringing projects home. I think she was trying to lose herself in the mundane, to forget the horrors we'd witnessed, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and she'd wake up screaming more nights than not. As for me, I couldn't forget. The shard of the artifact never left my possession. I kept it in a small wooden box, hidden in the back of our closet. But even there I could feel its presence, a constant pull at the edge of my consciousness. Weeks turned into months. We went through the motions of normal life, but there was a distance between us now, a gulf filled with unspoken fears and shared trauma. We never talked about what happened in those woods, as if speaking about it might somehow make it more real. Then exactly 1 year after our ordeal, everything changed again. I woke up in the middle of the night to find Grace's side of the bed empty. Panic gripped me as I searched the apartment, calling her name. I found her in the living room, standing by the window, staring out into the night. "Grace," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned to me, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were completely black, reflecting the dim light like polished obsidian. When she spoke, her voice was overlaid with something ancient and terrifying. "It's time, James," she said. "They're coming." As if on cue, the ground began to tremble. Outside, the sky lit up with an otherworldly glow. In the distance, I could hear screams. I ran to the closet and retrieved the wooden box. The shard inside was pulsing with energy, resonating with whatever was happening outside. As I held it, knowledge flooded my mind, of ancient pacts, of cosmic cycles, of a war between realities that had been raging since the dawn of time. I understood then that what we'd experienced in Virginia was just the beginning. The boundary between worlds was crumbling, and the horrors we'd glimpsed were breaking through. But I also realized that we weren't helpless. The shard had changed us, prepared us. We had a role to play in what was to come. I turned to Grace, seeing my own determination reflected in her alien eyes. "What do we do?" I asked. A smile spread across her face, both familiar and utterly foreign. "We fight," she said. Together we stepped out into a world transforming before our eyes. The street was chaos. People running, strange creatures emerging from tears in the fabric of reality. But we weren't afraid anymore. We had seen the face of cosmic horror and survived. We had been chosen, for better or worse, to stand against the coming darkness. As we made our way through the pandemonium, I felt a strange sense of purpose. The world as we knew it was ending, yes, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Out of this chaos, something new would emerge, and we would be there to shape it. The shard pulsed in my hand, its power flowing through me. Grace's eyes glowed with eldritch energy. Around us, reality continued to warp and change. Our ordeal in the Virginia woods had been just the prologue. Now the true story was beginning. A tale of cosmic horror, of humanity's struggle against forces beyond comprehension. And we were at the center of it all. As we faced the oncoming storm of otherworldly terrors, I realized that our nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, but this time we were ready. Whatever horrors awaited us, whatever cosmic entities sought to unmake our reality, we would face them together. For in glimpsing the true face of terror, we had found a strength we never knew we possessed. And in the shadow of annihilation, we had discovered a terrible, wonderful truth. The real monsters weren't the cosmic horrors breaking through into our world. The real monsters were what we were becoming to fight them. The weight of my decision to take a break from work had lifted as we drove deeper into Virginia's Appalachian foothills that autumn morning in 2019. Every mile that passed put more distance between us and the crushing responsibilities I'd left behind at Shenandoah National Park, where I'd served as a senior ranger for the past decade. My wife Janet squeezed my hand as our truck wound through the mist-shrouded mountains, and I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. "You needed this," she said softly, her green eyes crinkling at the corners. We both did. She wasn't wrong. The past year had been particularly brutal, with 3 missing hiker cases that had consumed my life and strained our marriage to its breaking point. The most recent one had ended badly. A college student who'd wandered off trail and whose remains we'd found 2 weeks too late. I couldn't shake the guilt, the feeling that if I just pushed harder, searched longer, maybe things would have turned out differently. The cabin we'd rented was exactly what we needed, remote enough that cell service was non-existent, yet still technically within the bounds of civilization. Ravens Hollow wasn't even a proper town, just a scattered collection of homes and hunting cabins tucked into the valleys between the mountains. Our rental sat at the end of a dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance since the Carter administration. The listing had advertised it as rustic, which turned out to be a generous description. The cabin was a solid structure of weathered logs and stone, with a tin roof that had developed a pleasant patina of rust around the edges. A deep porch wrapped around 2 sides, complete with a pair of rocking chairs that had seen better days. It wasn't much, but it was ours for the next 2 weeks. "Home sweet home," I said, killing the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic noise, no human sounds at all, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a wood thrush. We spent that first afternoon settling in, unpacking our supplies and exploring the cabin's quirks. The interior was basic but functional. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a propane stove, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom that had been added sometime in the last century. The water came from a well, and the electricity was solar with a backup generator. It was simple, but it was exactly what we'd hoped for. That evening we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. Janet had made coffee in an old percolator we'd found in the kitchen, and the rich aroma mixed with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. "Tell me what you're thinking," Janet said, her coffee cup cradled in both hands. I considered the question carefully. "I'm thinking about how quiet it is, how different it feels from the park." I paused, watching a bat dart across the darkening sky. Back there, even in the wilderness areas, you're never really alone. There's always someone on a radio, always another ranger within reach. Here, I gestured at the surrounding forest. Here it feels like we could be the last people on Earth. Janet nodded, but something in her expression made me look closer. "What is it?" "Nothing," she said quickly, too quickly. "It's just different. The forest here feels different." I knew what she meant, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The trees were the same species I worked with every day, oak, hickory, pine, but something about them felt wrong. It was as if they were arranged in a way that defied natural growth patterns, their branches reaching toward each other at odd angles. That night, we made dinner on the old stove and played cards by lamplight. The cabin's windows were single-pane glass, and as darkness fell, they became black mirrors that reflected our own faces back at us. Every so often I caught myself glancing at them, half expecting to see something else looking in. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect hiking weather. We ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and headed out to explore the surrounding area. The cabin came with a crude map drawn by the owner, showing a network of old logging trails that crisscrossed the property. "Let's try this one," I suggested, pointing to a trail that led to something marked as Devil's Chair, presumably some kind of rock formation. Janet agreed, and we set off with day packs containing water, trail mix, and basic first aid supplies. Old habits die hard. The trail was overgrown but still visible, winding through stands of ancient hardwoods. As we walked, I found myself falling into ranger mode, noting features and landmarks: a lightning-struck oak, a distinctive boulder, a creek crossing. It was automatic, the result of years spent teaching people how to navigate wilderness safely. About 2 miles in, we came across something odd. The trail passed through a small clearing, and in the center stood a circle of stones, each about the size of a basketball. They were arranged too precisely to be natural, but they were covered in moss and lichen that suggested they'd been there for years. "Probably just local kids," Janet said, but her voice held a note of uncertainty. I knelt to examine one of the stones. The moss had grown in strange patterns, forming what looked almost like letters or symbols. "Maybe," I said, "but this feels old, really old." We continued on, but the discovery had changed something about the atmosphere. The forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The bird song that had accompanied us earlier had faded to nothing, leaving only the sound of our own footsteps and breathing. Devil's Chair turned out to be a natural, throne-like formation in a cliff face, created by centuries of erosion. We ate lunch there, looking out over the valley below. The view should have been spectacular, but a haze hung in the air, making everything look slightly wrong, like a photograph that's slightly out of focus. "Do you smell that?" Janet asked suddenly. I did. It was faint but distinctive, the sweet, sour odor of something rotting. As a ranger, I was familiar with the smell of decay in the forest, but this was different. This smell had an almost metallic edge to it. "Probably a dead animal," I said, but I was already packing up our lunch. "We should head back." The return journey felt longer somehow, though we were following the same trail. The shadows had lengthened, despite it being only early afternoon, and more than once I caught movement in my peripheral vision, quick darting shapes that vanished when I turned to look. We were about a half-mile from the cabin when we found the first real sign that something was wrong. There, hanging from a low branch, was. I reached up and took it down, examining it closely. The twigs were bound tight with long strands of gray hair woven into an intricate pattern. It looked old, the wood weathered and the hair brittle, but it had been placed there recently. The branch it hung from was still green where it had been broken. "Let's get back to the cabin," I said, dropping the bundle and wiping my hands on my pants. The feeling of the hair against my skin had left me feeling unclean. We walked faster after that, nearly jogging by the time the cabin came into view. Only when we were inside with the door locked did I realize how tense I'd become. My shoulders ached from being hunched, and my hand was cramped from gripping my hiking pole too tightly. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace, neither of us mentioned what we'd found in the woods. Instead, we talked about normal things: work, family, plans for the future. But there was an undercurrent of tension in every word, every gesture. We both kept glancing at the windows, though the curtains were drawn. I woke in the middle of the night to absolute silence. Even the usual forest sounds, the hooting of owls, the rustle of nocturnal animals, had ceased. Janet was asleep beside me, her breathing deep and regular. Something had woken me, but I couldn't say what. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound from the porch. Not the random noises of the cabin settling, but deliberate movements. Someone or something was out there. I slid out of bed, careful not to wake Janet, and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. The hunting rifle was in the main room, propped in the corner by the door. I moved silently through the cabin, years of wilderness experience making my steps silent on the old floorboards. The scraping continued, moving from the front of the cabin to the side. I positioned myself by the window, flashlight ready but unlit. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see by, but the angle was wrong. I couldn't see what was making the noise without opening the curtain. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there must be able to hear it. The scraping stopped directly outside the window. For a long moment nothing moved. Then slowly, A shadow fell across the curtain, something tall, much taller than a person should be. I threw back the curtain and switched on the flashlight in one motion. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. The porch was empty, but there, in the dirt beyond the porch steps, were tracks. They looked almost human, but wrong, too large, too deep, with too many toes. I stood there for what felt like hours, scanning the tree line with the flashlight. The beam seemed weak, unable to penetrate more than a few feet into the darkness between the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself to return to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the silence and wondering what else was out there, listening too. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The forest felt hostile now, as if every tree concealed a threat. Janet must have felt it too. She stayed close to the cabin, busying herself with cleaning and organizing our supplies. I went out to examine the tracks I'd seen in the night, but the morning dew had softened the ground, making them almost indistinguishable. Almost, but not quite. What I could still see made no sense. The prints seemed to change as they moved away from the cabin, becoming less human with each step. Around noon, the fog rolled in. It came not from the valley as you might expect, but down from the mountaintops, thick and gray and somehow wrong. It moved against the wind, flowing like water between the trees, and brought with it that same sweet rot smell we'd encountered at Devil's Chair. "We should leave," Janet said, watching the fog through the kitchen window. "Something isn't right here." She was right, of course. Every instinct I'd developed over years in the wilderness was screaming at me to go. But when I tried to start the truck, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, though it had been fine just days before. I opened the hood and found the battery cables had been cut clean through. Not frayed or broken, cut with surgical precision. My hands were shaking as I slammed the hood shut. "Ryan," Janet called from the porch. "What's wrong?" I showed her the cables. Her face went pale. Who would do this?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to get out of here. The ranger station isn't too far. Maybe 10 miles if we follow the main road." We quickly packed what we could carry: water, food, first aid supplies, the rifle, though I had only a handful of rounds, and a few other essentials. The fog had grown thicker while we prepared, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. As we stepped off the porch, I heard something that made my blood run cold: singing. It was distant and faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. A woman's voice singing what sounded like a lullaby in a language I didn't recognize. Janet grabbed my hand. "Where is that coming from?" I shook my head. The fog seemed to distort sound, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. The singing continued as we started down the road, sometimes seeming to come from ahead of us, sometimes from behind. We'd been walking for about an hour when we came to the first body. It was a deer, or what was left of one, arranged in the middle of the road. The animal had been changed. Its limbs were twisted and elongated, its neck bent at an impossible angle so that its head faced backward. But worst of all were its eyes. They'd been replaced with what looked like small stone circles, similar to the ones we'd found in the clearing. Janet turned away and retched. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't take my eyes off the deer. Something about its position seemed deliberate, like it had been placed there as a message, or a warning. The fog grew thicker as we continued down the road, and the singing grew closer. Sometimes it seemed to come from just a few feet away, hidden in the white murk that surrounded us. The voice was clearer now, definitely female, definitely old, and definitely wrong. The words were guttural and harsh, despite the gentle melody. We came to a fork in the road that shouldn't have been there. I knew these mountains, had studied the maps extensively before we came, and this intersection didn't exist. Both paths looked identical, disappearing into the fog. That's when we heard the cry for help. It came from somewhere ahead, a man's voice, weak and pained. "Help! Someone, please!" Janet's grip on my hand tightened. "Ryan, no." But I was already moving forward, drawn by years of training and instinct. The voice called again, closer now, and I could hear the desperation in it, or what sounded like desperation. We found him slumped against a tree just off the road, a man in torn hiking clothes, his face pale and drawn. Blood stained his shirt, though I couldn't see any obvious wounds. "Thank God," he rasped. "I didn't think anyone would find me." I approached cautiously, keeping Janet behind me. Something about this felt wrong. The way he was positioned, the lack of real injuries despite the blood, the fact that he was here at all. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my distance. I got lost," he said. "Something attacked me." His eyes darted around, never quite focusing on us. Something in the fog. I took another step closer, and that's when I noticed it. He wasn't breathing. His chest wasn't moving at all, and when I looked closely, I could see that the blood on his shirt was old, dark, and crusty. He moved faster than anything human should be able to move. One moment he was slumped against the tree, the next he was lunging at me, hands outstretched, mouth open to reveal rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. I managed to get the rifle up in time, using it as a bar to keep him at bay. His strength was incredible. The rifle barrel began to bend under the pressure. His face was inches from mine, and this close I could see that his eyes were just like the deer's, stone circles with ancient symbols carved into them. Janet screamed, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell had held us there. I drove my knee up into his stomach and pushed, sending him stumbling backward. Without thinking, I brought the rifle to my shoulder and fired. The shot echoed through the fog, but the figure didn't fall. Instead, it straightened up slowly, a hole in its chest leaking not blood but a thick black fluid that steamed in the cold air. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, but the voice wasn't human anymore. It was deep and resonant, like stones grinding together underground. "This place isn't for your kind." I fired again and again until the rifle clicked empty. The thing that looked like a man was still standing, though black fluid now poured from multiple wounds. It took a step toward us, then another. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Janet's hand. We plunged into the fog, away from the road, away from that thing. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran, and more than once we nearly fell over hidden roots or rocks. The fog seemed alive now, swirling around us in patterns that couldn't be natural. The singing had returned, louder than ever, coming from everywhere at once. Other voices had joined it, men, women, children, all singing that same terrible song in that same ancient language. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs trembled, then ran some more. I had no idea where we were going. The fog made it impossible to navigate, and we'd left the road far behind. All we could do was keep moving, trying to stay ahead of whatever was pursuing us. Because something was pursuing us. We could hear it crashing through the undergrowth behind us, moving faster than anything should be able to move through this dense forest. Sometimes we caught glimpses of it through the fog, a tall, dark shape that seemed to flow between the trees like smoke. Other times we heard it, that grinding, stone-on-stone voice calling out in words that hurt to hear. The fog was playing tricks with our minds. More than once we found ourselves running in circles, passing the same twisted trees and malformed rocks again and again. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Had we been running for minutes or hours? The light never changed, trapped in an eternal twilight by the thick gray soup surrounding us. Janet stumbled and fell, her ankle turning on a hidden root. I helped her up, but she could barely put weight on it. The thing behind us was getting closer. I could smell that rotting metal odor growing stronger. "Leave me," Janet gasped, but I cut her off before she could finish the thought. "Not happening." I wrapped her arm around my shoulders, taking as much of her weight as I could. We moved slower now, but I'd be damned if I was going to leave her behind. That's when we found the stones. They rose out of the fog like ancient teeth, a perfect circle of standing stones, each one at least 12 feet tall. They weren't natural formations. Each stone was carved with symbols similar to the ones we'd seen before, but larger and more complex. The ground inside the circle was bare earth, marked with more symbols drawn in what looked horribly like dried blood. We had no choice. The thing pursuing us was too close, and Janet couldn't run anymore. We entered the circle, and immediately the fog cleared, as if the stones themselves were keeping it at bay. The singing stopped too, replaced by an absolute silence that pressed against our ears like cotton wool. "What is this place?" Janet whispered, her voice seeming impossibly loud in the stillness. Before I could answer, we heard it, that grinding voice closer than ever. The old place, it said, the waiting place. The thing that had been pursuing us stepped into the circle. In the clear air, I could finally see it properly, though my mind rebelled at what I was seeing. It still wore the shape of the man we'd encountered, but the skin had split in places, revealing something dark and ancient underneath. Its movements were wrong, like a puppet being controlled by inexpert hands. "You have brought yourself to judgment," it said, and its voice was joined by others, dozens of voices speaking in unison from the fog beyond the stones. The hollow hungers. What happened next is difficult to describe, partly because my mind keeps trying to protect me from the memory. The thing, the puppet man, began to change. Its skin split completely, peeling away like old wallpaper to reveal what lay beneath. What I saw, what we saw. The creature that emerged was ancient. Not just old, but ancient in a way that preceded humanity, preceded life itself. It was composed of angles that shouldn't exist, of spaces that hurt to look at. Its surface was like living stone, flowing and shifting in patterns that made my eyes water and my brain scream. But worse than its appearance was what it showed us. Images began to flood my mind, memories that weren't mine, knowledge that no human was meant to possess. I saw the hollow as it truly was. Not just a valley in the Appalachians, but a place where reality wore thin, where things from outside could slip through. The standing stones were a gate, I realized. No, not just a gate, a trap. The circle had been built eons ago by people who understood what lived in these mountains, who knew how to contain it. But containment wasn't permanent. It needed to feed. Janet's scream snapped me out of the vision. She had collapsed, her hands pressed against her temples, blood trickling from her nose. The creature was moving toward her, its form shifting and flowing like liquid stone. Something inside me snapped, all the fear, all the horror transformed into rage. I still had my knife, the ranger's knife I'd carried for years. Without thinking, I charged forward, blade extended. The creature was fast, but I was moving on pure instinct now. The knife struck one of the symbols carved into its surface, and the effect was immediate. A sound like shattering glass filled the air, and cracks began to spread across the creature's surface. "The old signs," it said, its voice now filled with something that might have been fear. "You cannot." But I could. The symbols on the standing stones were glowing now, resonating with whatever power was contained in my strike. I slashed again and again, each hit sending more cracks spreading across the creature's surface. It tried to retreat, to flow back into the fog, but the stones held it in place. The voices from the fog had turned to screams, not of rage, but of pain and fear. The very air seemed to be vibrating, the symbols on the stones glowing brighter and brighter. What happened next is mostly a blur. The creature shattered like glass, each piece dissolving into nothing before it hit the ground. The fog rushed in, but it was different now, thinner, natural. The voices faded to nothing, and the oppressive weight that had hung over everything lifted. I helped Janet to her feet. Her nose had stopped bleeding, but she was pale and shaking. Together we made our way out of the stone circle. Whether by luck or something else, we found the road within minutes. The sun was rising. Apparently we'd spent the entire night in that nightmare. Its light felt clean and pure, burning away the last remnants of whatever darkness had held the hollow in its grip. We walked until we found help, a local farmer who took one look at our battered, blood-stained appearance and drove us straight to the nearest hospital. The authorities searched the area, of course, but they found nothing. The standing stones were gone as if they'd never existed. Even the cabin showed no signs of our experience. The truck's battery cables were intact, though we'd seen them cut. That was 5 years ago. Janet and I have moved on, or at least we've tried to. We left Virginia, left the Park Service entirely. We live in Arizona now, where the desert feels clean and empty in a way that forests never will again. But sometimes on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I hear singing, and in my dreams I see those symbols, glowing with an ancient power that humanity was never meant to understand. I wake from these dreams with a certainty that what we encountered wasn't destroyed, merely wounded, waiting in that hollow for new victims to stumble into its trap. I write this now as a warning. If you find yourself in the Appalachian foothills, in a place that feels wrong in ways you can't quite explain, turn back. Some places aren't meant for us. Some hungers can never be satisfied. The hollow is waiting. It remembers, and it hungers still. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stood on the porch of my cabin, nestled deep in the Allegheny Mountains. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest that surrounded my home. It had been 3 years since I, David Reeves, and my wife Anna had decided to leave our hectic lives in Pittsburgh behind and embrace a simpler existence here in the wilderness. At 42, I had grown weary of the constant noise, the endless meetings, and the suffocating pressure of city life. Anna, a nurse by profession, had felt the same way. We both craved something different, something real. When we stumbled upon this property, 50 acres of pristine woodland with a rustic cabin at its heart, we knew we had found our escape. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. Built in the 1950s, it had a certain charm that spoke to both of us. We spent the first few months renovating, making it livable while still maintaining its rustic appeal. Solar panels provided what little electricity we needed, and a well supplied our water. It was simple, but it was ours. I had always been drawn to nature, spending my weekends hiking and camping whenever I could escape the city. But living here, surrounded by the endless green of the forest, was different. It was a total immersion, a chance to reconnect with something primal and real. Anna adapted well to our new life, but she still enjoyed occasional trips back to civilization. She had left 2 days ago to visit her sister in Philadelphia, leaving me alone with the wilderness. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I relished it. These were the times when I felt most at peace, most in tune with the rhythms of the forest. But something felt off this time. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a vague sense of unease that had settled over me since Anna's departure. Small things, a tool missing from the shed, a strange smell near the creek, an unusual silence that fell over the woods at odd hours, all contributed to a growing feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. The wilderness had its own rhythms, its own logic. It wasn't my place to question it. Still, as I stood on the porch that morning, watching the mist rise from the valley below, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. With a sigh, I turned and went back inside the cabin. The interior was cozy, with rough-hewn wooden walls adorned with a few family photos and some of Anna's paintings. Our living space was open plan, with a small kitchen area, a dining table, and a sitting area centered around a large stone fireplace. A narrow staircase led to the loft where our bedroom was situated. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat at the table, poring over a topographical map of the surrounding area. There was a section of the property, about 5 miles to the north, that I hadn't explored in a while. It seemed like the perfect distraction from the nagging unease that had been plaguing me. Decision made, I began to prepare for a day hike. I packed a small backpack with essentials, water, some trail mix, a first aid kit, and a compass. After a moment's hesitation, I also strapped on my hunting rifle. I didn't expect to use it, but something told me it might be wise to have it along. As I stepped out into the cool morning air, I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. The forest stretched out before me, a sea of green under the brightening sky. Whatever was out there, whatever was causing this feeling of disquiet, I was determined to face it head on. Little did I know that this decision would lead me down a path that would forever change my understanding of the world around me and test the very limits of my sanity. The trail I chose was one I had cut myself a few years back, a narrow path that wound through dense patches of pines and oaks. The ground was soft underfoot, still damp from a recent rain. As I walked, I tried to focus on the familiar sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the leaves. But even these familiar noises seemed somehow off, as if they were being performed by actors who hadn't quite learned their parts. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. It reminded me of the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, that palpable tension in the air that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But the sky above was clear, a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. About 2 hours into my hike, I reached an area I hadn't visited since the previous spring. It was a small clearing dominated by an unusual rock formation, a natural monument that jutted out of the earth like the spine of some ancient buried beast. I had always found it fascinating, an anomaly in the otherwise uniform landscape. I climbed up the formation, enjoying the elevation and the opportunity to survey the surrounding forest. The Alleghenies stretched out in every direction, a vast sea of green beneath the azure sky. It was breathtaking, a reminder of why I had chosen this life. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear. It was moving through the trees at a distance, its shape indistinct in the dappled sunlight. I squinted, trying to make it out, but it was too far away. Just a shadow, really, weaving in and out of the trees with a fluid grace that seemed almost unnatural. I watched for several minutes, my heart rate gradually increasing as I realized that something wasn't right about the way it moved. It was too fast, too deliberate, not like any animal I'd ever encountered in these woods. Against my better judgment, I climbed down from the rock formation and started in the direction of the movement. My rifle was in my hands now, no longer just a precaution but a necessity. I moved slowly, carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. Years of hunting had taught me how to move through the forest quietly, but now those skills were being put to a test I had never anticipated. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the canopy grew thicker, filtering the sunlight into narrow, shifting beams. The air grew cooler, and I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the leaves. It was as if the entire world had been muted. Then I found the tracks. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. At first glance, they resembled bear tracks, but as I knelt to examine them more closely, I realized they were far too large. The impressions were deep, with clear claw marks that dug into the soft earth. But it was the spacing that truly unnerved me. Whatever had made these tracks had an unnatural gait, almost as if it had been walking on 2 legs rather than 4. My mind raced through possibilities, an escaped exotic animal perhaps, or some kind of mutant bear. But none of these explanations felt right. Deep in my gut, I knew I was dealing with something outside the realm of my experience, something that shouldn't exist. I should have turned back then. Every instinct screamed at me to return to the safety of my cabin, to call the authorities, to pretend I had never seen these impossible tracks. But a mix of curiosity and stubbornness drove me forward. I had to know what had made these marks. I had to see it for myself. As I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me. The air grew thick and heavy, almost difficult to breathe. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, every nerve in my body on high alert. This was madness, I knew, but I couldn't stop. Something was compelling me forward, an almost magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. The tracks led me to the edge of a small ravine. The ground sloped sharply downward, forming a hollow choked with deadfall and moss-covered stones. And there, standing just at the edge of the ravine, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, was something that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. At first, in the dim light, I thought it was a man. The shape was upright, bipedal. But as my eyes adjusted and I was able to make out more details, I realized I was looking at something that defied explanation. It was tall, much taller than any human, its head nearly brushing the lower branches of the trees. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a gaunt skeletal frame. Dark, matted fur grew in patches along its arms and legs. But it was the face that truly horrified me. The creature's eyes were deep black pits, seeming to absorb what little light there was rather than reflect it. Its mouth hung open slightly, revealing rows of jagged yellowed teeth. As I watched, frozen in terror, a long, serpentine tongue flicked out, tasting the air. My hands shook as I raised my rifle, but I couldn't bring myself to fire. The creature hadn't moved, hadn't made any aggressive gestures. It simply stood there, watching me with those bottomless eyes, as if it were as curious about me as I was terrified of it. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a surreal standoff. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist in the rational, ordered world I thought I knew. Then, With a speed that defied its size, the creature moved. One moment it was standing at the edge of the ravine, and the next it was charging towards me, covering the ground between us in impossible leaps. Its mouth opened wider than should have been physically possible, that terrible tongue lashing out like a whip. I fired. Once, twice. The shots echoed through the trees, but in my panic I missed. The creature was almost upon me, close enough that I could smell its fetid breath, could see my own terrified reflection in those pit-like eyes. I scrambled backward, nearly tripping over a fallen branch. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and adrenaline. I fired again, and this time I didn't miss. The bullet struck the creature square in the chest, and it stumbled, letting out a sound that was part hiss, part roar. But it didn't fall. It didn't even slow down. That's when I turned and ran. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted through the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls crashing through the underbrush. I fired blindly over my shoulder, not even sure if I was hitting anything. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. All I could think about was reaching the cabin. If I could just make it back, I had a chance. There were more guns there, walls to put between me and this impossible monster. I burst through the tree line, the cabin coming into view ahead. My chest heaved with exhaustion, but I pushed myself harder, my feet pounding against the ground. I could still hear it behind me, closer now, its rasping breath like that of a predator on the hunt. With a final burst of speed, I reached the porch and threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I bolted it and backed away, my hands fumbling for the shotgun mounted above the fireplace. The creature slammed into the door with a force that shook the entire cabin. The wood groaned, but it held. I racked the shotgun, my pulse roaring in my ears. Another impact hit the door, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. And then it stopped. I stood there, shotgun aimed at the door, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting. The silence was deafening. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Slowly, cautiously, I crept toward the door, the shotgun raised. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. Nothing. With trembling hands, I unbolted the door and opened it just a crack, peering out into the dim light of the evening. The porch was empty. The forest beyond was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze as if nothing had happened. But the tracks were there, deep impressions in the dirt leading away from the cabin. It was gone for now. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it would be back. I closed and bolted the door, then methodically checked every window, every possible entry point. As night fell, I sat in the darkness, shotgun across my lap, jumping at every sound. Sleep was out of the question. All I could do was wait and wonder what kind of world I had stumbled into, where such creatures could exist. And in the back of my mind, a terrifying thought began to form. What if it wasn't alone? The night passed in a haze of terror and vigilance. Every creak of the cabin's old wood, every rustle of leaves outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I sat in the darkness, shotgun clutched to my chest, my eyes never leaving the door. But the creature didn't return. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I felt the tension in my body begin to ease, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. I hadn't slept, hadn't even moved from my position by the fireplace. My muscles ached, and my mind felt foggy from the prolonged state of high alert. Slowly, stiffly, I rose to my feet. My first instinct was to call someone, the police, the Forest Service, anyone who might be able to help. But as I reached for my phone, I hesitated. What would I tell them? That I had been chased through the woods by some kind of monster? They'd think I was crazy or drunk or both. No, I realized. I needed proof. I needed to document what had happened, to gather evidence before I involved anyone else. With this thought in mind, I cautiously opened the front door, wincing at the damage caused by the creature's assault. Deep gouges marred the wood, and the frame was splintered in several places. It was a stark reminder that what had happened was real, not some vivid hallucination brought on by isolation. The morning was cool and misty, the forest shrouded in a light fog that gave everything an otherworldly quality. I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the woods were calm, peaceful even. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was as if nature itself was conspiring to make me doubt my own memories. But the tracks were still there, clear impressions in the soft earth leading away from the cabin. I followed them to the edge of the clearing, my camera in hand. I took dozens of photos documenting every detail, the size of the prints, the claw marks, the unusual gait. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere in the depths of the forest, those black, pit-like eyes were fixed on me. The tracks led into the woods, following the same path I had taken the day before. Part of me wanted to follow them, to see where they led. But the memory of the creature's impossible speed and strength held me back. I wasn't prepared for another encounter, not yet. Instead, I returned to the cabin and began the process of fortifying it as best I could. I nailed boards over the windows, reinforced the door with extra locks, and moved furniture to create barricades. As I worked, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. What was that thing? Where had it come from? And most pressingly, what did it want? The way it had watched me, with what seemed like curiosity as much as hunger, suggested an intelligence behind those terrible eyes. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There was purpose there, intention. As the day wore on, I found myself jumping at every sound, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I knew I needed to sleep, to give my overtaxed mind a chance to rest and process. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale, elongated face, those rows of jagged teeth. Finally, as evening approached, exhaustion won out. I retreated to the loft, shotgun by my side, and fell into a fitful sleep. My dreams were a chaotic jumble of running through endless woods, of claws reaching for me from the shadows, of that rasping, hissing breath always just behind me. I woke with a start several hours later, my heart pounding. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came flooding back. The creature, the chase, the long night of terror. I lay there in the darkness, straining my ears for any sound out of place. And then I heard it, a soft scratching at the door downstairs. My breath caught in my throat. It was back. I eased out of bed, trying to move as silently as possible. The scratching continued, accompanied now by a low, rumbling sound that was almost like speech, but too distorted, too alien to be human. With trembling hands, I picked up the shotgun and made my way down the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and I winced at every sound, certain that the creature outside could hear my approach. The scratching at the door continued, punctuated by that low, rumbling, not quite speech. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, a new sound joined the cacophony, a slow, deliberate tapping on the window. My blood ran cold. There was more than one of them out there. I pressed my back against the wall next to the window, trying to steady my breathing. Slowly, carefully, I tilted my head just enough to peer out. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. There were 3 of them. 3 impossibly tall, pale figures standing in the clearing before my cabin. 2 were at the door, their elongated fingers scratching at the wood. The third stood directly in front of the window, its black eyes seeming to stare right through the glass, right at me. I jerked back, hoping it hadn't seen me. But the tapping on the window intensified, becoming more insistent. They knew I was here. They were trying to get in. My mind raced. What could I do? The cabin suddenly felt like a trap rather than a sanctuary. If they managed to break through, I'd have nowhere to run. The scratching at the door became more forceful, the wood groaning under the assault. I could hear it splintering, knew it was only a matter of time before it gave way. In that moment of pure terror, a strange calm settled over me. If this was how it ended, I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I raised the shotgun, aiming at the door, and waited. The next few minutes were a blur of violence and noise. The door finally gave way with a thunderous crash, and I fired, the shotgun's roar deafening in the confined space of the cabin. I saw one of the creatures stagger back, black ichor spraying from its chest. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a shriek that shook the very foundations of the cabin. I fired again and again, each shot driving the creatures back momentarily, but never seeming to cause any lasting damage. They were inside now, their massive forms hunched under the low ceiling, those terrible mouths opening wide to reveal rows of gleaming teeth. I retreated up the stairs, firing until the shotgun clicked empty. In desperation, I threw it at the nearest creature. It batted the weapon aside effortlessly, advancing on me with inexorable slowness. As I backed into the bedroom, my hand closed around the handle of my hunting knife. It seemed absurdly small, almost laughable in the face of these monstrosities, but it was all I had left. Just as the first creature reached the top of the stairs, a sound cut through the chaos, a long, mournful howl from somewhere in the forest. The creatures froze, their heads tilting as if listening. Then, to my utter astonishment, they retreated. They loped down the stairs and out of the ruined door, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had come. I stood there, knife in hand, for what felt like hours, unable to believe what had just happened. What had called them away? And more importantly, would they be back? As the adrenaline ebbed, the full impact of what had just occurred hit me. I sank to the floor, my body shaking uncontrollably. I had just faced death, had looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, and somehow, miraculously, I had survived. But as I sat there in the wreckage of my home, surrounded by shell casings and splintered wood, I knew that this was far from over. Whatever these creatures were, wherever they had come from, they weren't done with me. And I had a sinking feeling that I had just gotten my first glimpse of a world hidden beneath the surface of our own, a world of nightmares and impossible things. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. It wasn't safe. I needed to leave, to get help, to find answers, but most of all I needed to warn others, because if these creatures were out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, then no one was safe. With shaking hands I began to pack, throwing clothes and supplies into a backpack. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do when I got there, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As the sun rose fully, casting long shadows across the devastated interior of my cabin, I finished packing. My backpack was heavy with supplies: food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, and as much ammunition as I could carry. I had reloaded the shotgun and strapped it across my back, the weight of it both reassuring and ominous. Before leaving, I took one last look around the cabin that had been my home for the past 3 years. The place that had once represented peace and solitude now felt tainted, violated by the intrusion of something beyond my understanding. I thought of Anna still in Philadelphia, blissfully unaware of the horror that had unfolded here. I couldn't call her, couldn't risk bringing her back to this. Not until I understood what was happening, not until I knew it was safe. With a heavy heart, I stepped out into the morning light. The forest was quiet, almost peaceful. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was hard to believe that just hours ago this same idyllic scene had been the backdrop for a nightmare. I made my way to my old truck, parked at the edge of the clearing. It was a reliable vehicle, one that had served me well on countless hunting trips. Now it would be my escape route. As I turned the key in the ignition, I half expected it not to start, as if the strangeness of the past day had somehow affected even this mundane piece of machinery. But the engine roared to life, and I felt a small measure of relief. As I drove down the winding dirt road that led away from my property, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow in the trees seemed to hide one of those pale, elongated figures. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I pressed down harder on the accelerator, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and the site of my terrifying encounter. My plan, such as it was to head to the nearest town, a small place called Millbrook, about 30 miles to the east. From there, I hoped to find someone who would believe my story, someone who could help me make sense of what had happened. The drive was tense, every curve in the road bringing with it the possibility of danger. But as I emerged from the dense forest onto the main highway, I felt some of the tension start to ease. The familiar sights of civilization, road signs, other cars, even a gas station in the distance, helped ground me in reality. I pulled into the gas station, suddenly aware of how I must look, disheveled, wide-eyed, clutching a shotgun. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, gave me a wary look as I approached. "Everything all right, mister?" he asked, his hand hovering near the phone as if ready to call for help. I realized then the difficulty of my situation. How could I explain what had happened without sounding completely insane? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I "I've had a rough night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's been some trouble up in the woods. I need to speak to the sheriff. Is he in town?" The attendant's expression softened slightly, though he still looked suspicious. "Sheriff's office is just down the main street, can't miss it. But if you're in some kind of trouble—" I shook my head. "Nothing like that. Just, I saw something up there, something that needs to be investigated." He nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't quite believe me. I paid for my gas and a map of the area, then headed back to my truck. As I pulled out of the station, I saw the attendant pick up the phone. No doubt he was calling ahead to warn the sheriff about the wild-eyed man with a gun heading his way. The sheriff's office was indeed easy to find, a small brick building with a few patrol cars parked outside. I parked my truck and sat there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. How could I tell this story without sounding like a lunatic? Would anyone believe me without proof? As I stepped out of the truck, shotgun in hand, I saw 2 deputies emerge from the building, their hands on their holsters. I slowly placed the shotgun on the ground and raised my hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I called out. "I need to speak to the sheriff. It's urgent." One of the deputies approached cautiously. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." I complied, allowing myself to be patted down and handcuffed. As they led me into the building, I felt a mix of frustration and relief. At least here, surrounded by the trappings of law and order, I felt safe from the creatures that had invaded my home. The sheriff, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, was waiting for me in the interview room. As I was uncuffed and seated across from him, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "All right, Mr. Reeves," he said, consulting a file in front of him. "I understand you've got quite a story to tell. Why don't you start from the beginning?" And so I did. I told him everything. The strange tracks, the first sighting of the creature, the attack on my cabin. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief on his face slowly turn to concern. Whether he believed me or not, he could tell that I at least believed what I was saying. When I finished, the sheriff sat back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "That's got quite a tale, Mr. Reeves. I have to say, in all my years on the force, I've never heard anything quite like it." "I know how it sounds," I said, leaning forward, "but I swear to you every word is true. There's something out there in those woods, Sheriff, something dangerous. You have to send someone to investigate." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Mr. Reeves, I can see you've been through something, and I promise you we'll look into it. But right now I think what you need is rest. We've got a doctor on call who can—" "I don't need a doctor," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "I need someone to believe me. Those things are still out there, and they're not going to stop. More people could get hurt or worse." The sheriff held up a placating hand. "Calm down, Mr. Reeves. No one's accusing you of anything. But you have to understand how this sounds from our perspective. We can't just send a team into the woods based on this." I slumped back in my chair, the fight going out of me. Of course they didn't believe me. How could they? If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff's expression softened. "For now, I think you should get some rest. We can put you up in a motel for the night. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, we can send a deputy out to your cabin with you to check things out. How does that sound?" I nodded, too exhausted to argue further. As the sheriff led me out of the interview room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. Those creatures were still out there, and I was no closer to understanding what they were or how to stop them. As I lay in the small motel room that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew sleep wouldn't come. My mind was too full of questions, too haunted by the memory of those black, empty eyes. And underneath it all was a growing certainty that this was only the beginning. Whatever was happening in those woods, whatever those creatures were, I had a sinking feeling that my encounter with them was far from over. In the darkness of the motel room, I made a silent vow. I would find answers. I would make someone believe me, and no matter what it took, I would find a way to stop these creatures before they could hurt anyone else. Little did I know, as I lay there in the quiet of the night, that my ordeal was far from over. The creatures in the woods had marked me, and they weren't done with me yet, not by a long shot. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching my mood perfectly. I had managed to snatch a few hours of fitful sleep, plagued by nightmares of pale figures and gnashing teeth. As I sat on the edge of the motel bed, my head in my hands, I tried to gather my thoughts and plan my next move. A knock at the door made me jump. It was Deputy Hanson, a young officer I had met briefly the day before. He looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot as he spoke. "Mr. Reeves, the sheriff asked me to accompany you back to your cabin today. Are you sure you want to do this?" I nodded, grabbing my jacket. "I have to. You'll see when we get there. You'll understand." The drive back to my cabin was tense. Deputy Hanson tried to make small talk, but I was too preoccupied with what we might find to engage in conversation. As we turned onto the dirt road leading to my property, I felt my heart rate increase. What if the creatures were still there? What if they had destroyed everything, leaving no evidence behind? As we pulled into the clearing, I heard Hanson let out a low whistle. The cabin was a wreck. The door hung off its hinges, and deep gouges marred the wooden walls. It looked like it had been attacked by a bear, a very large, very angry bear. "My God," Hanson muttered, his hand instinctively going to his holster. "What could have done this?" I didn't answer. I was too busy scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, but the forest was still, almost unnaturally quiet. We approached the cabin cautiously. I pointed out the tracks to Hanson, watching as his expression changed from skepticism to confusion to something approaching fear. These aren't like anything I've ever seen," he said, crouching down to examine them more closely. Inside, the cabin was just as I had left it. Furniture overturned, shell casings scattered across the floor, deep claw marks gouged into the walls. Hanson walked through the wreckage, his face pale. "Mr. Reeves," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology. We didn't think—" "It's okay," I said, though it wasn't. None of this was okay. "What matters now is what we're going to do about it." Hanson nodded, pulling out his radio. "I need to call this in. The sheriff needs to see this." As Hanson made his call, I wandered through the ruins of my home. Everything felt wrong, tainted. This place that had once been my sanctuary now felt alien and hostile. A glint of something caught my eye. Under a pile of debris, I found a small metallic object. It looked like a scale or a piece of armor, about the size of a silver dollar. It was cool to the touch and seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I slipped it into my pocket, not sure why, but feeling that it might be important. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. More officers arrived, then forensic teams. They took photos, collected samples, asked endless questions. I answered as best I could, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They believed something had happened here, but not what I had told them, not the full truth. As evening approached, the sheriff pulled me aside. "Mr. Reeves, I want you to know we're taking this very seriously. We've got teams combing the woods, and we're bringing in some experts from the state to examine the evidence. But I have to ask, are you sure about what you saw? Is there any chance it could have been, a bear, or maybe some kind of large cat?" I shook my head, frustration welling up inside me. "Sheriff, I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear or a cat or anything else that's supposed to exist in these woods. It was something else, something not natural." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I believe you saw something. The evidence here, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. But what you're suggesting, it's hard to swallow. You understand that, right?" I nodded, too tired to argue. "I understand, but Sheriff, whatever did this, it's still out there. And I don't think it's done, not by a long shot." As if to punctuate my words, a long, mournful howl echoed through the woods. It was distant but unmistakable, the same sound that had called the creatures away on that terrible night. Every head turned toward the sound. I saw fear flash across the sheriff's face, quickly replaced by determination. He turned to his deputies, barking out orders. "I want everyone out of these woods before dark. Set up a perimeter around the property. No one goes in or out without my say-so. And get those wildlife experts here, ASAP." As the officers scrambled to follow his commands, the sheriff turned back to me. "Mr. Reeves, I think it's best if you come back to town with us. We can put you up in the motel again until we figure out what's going on here." I shook my head. "No, I need to stay. This is my home, Sheriff, and whatever those things are, they came here for a reason. I need to understand why." The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced him. He nodded reluctantly. "All right, but you're not staying alone. I'm leaving Deputy Hanson here with you, and I want you both armed at all times, understood?" I agreed, grateful for the support, even if I doubted how much good it would do against the creatures I had faced. As night fell, Hanson and I sat on the porch of my ruined cabin, shotguns across our laps. The forest was alive with the usual nighttime sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, but underneath it all was a tension, a sense of wrongness that set my teeth on edge. "Mr. Reeves," Hanson said, his voice low, "what exactly do you think those things are?" I shook my head. "I don't know. I've been asking myself that same question ever since I first saw them. They're not animals, at least not any kind of animal I've ever heard of. The way they moved, the way they looked at me. There was intelligence there. And malice." Hanson was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "my grandfather used to tell stories about these woods. Old legends passed down from the native tribes that lived here before the settlers came. He talked about spirits that lived in the deepest parts of the forest, creatures that were neither animal nor man. I always thought they were just stories meant to scare kids away from wandering too far into the woods. But now," his words sent a chill down my spine, "could there be some truth to those old legends? Had I stumbled upon something that had been hiding in these woods for centuries?" Before I could respond, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the porch. We both tensed, raising our shotguns. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a deer, a young buck by the looks of it. But something was wrong. It moved jerkily, as if it wasn't in full control of its body. And its eyes. Even in the dim light of our porch lamp, I could see that its eyes were completely black. "What the hell?" Hanson whispered, his knuckles white on his shotgun. The deer took another stumbling step towards us, and that's when I saw them. Long, pale fingers wrapped around its throat, almost invisible against its fur. The creature controlling the deer was using it as a shield, hiding behind it as it approached. "Hanson," I said, my voice shaking. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run." He nodded, his face pale in the lamplight. The deer was just a few yards away now. I could see the terror in its eyes, the unnatural way its body twisted as the creature manipulated it. And then, in a movement almost too fast to see, the creature revealed itself. It rose up behind the deer, its pale, elongated form unfolding like some terrible flower. Those black, pit-like eyes fixed on us, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. "Run!" I yelled, firing my shotgun at the creature. Hanson and I bolted off the porch, racing towards the woods on the far side of the clearing. Behind us I heard the deer's agonized bellow cut short, followed by the sound of tearing flesh. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, moving through the trees with impossible speed and grace. Hanson was panting heavily beside me, his eyes wide with terror. "We can't outrun it," he gasped. "We don't have to," I replied, spotting what I was looking for. A steep ravine cutting through the forest floor. "This way." We half ran, half slid down the ravine slope, loose rocks and soil giving way under our feet. At the bottom, a swift stream gurgled over moss-covered stones. "The water," I said, wading in. "It might mask our scent." We moved downstream as quickly as we could, the icy water numbing our legs. Behind us, I heard the creature's frustrated howl. It had lost our trail. For hours we slogged through the stream, only leaving the water when the terrain forced us to. We moved in tense silence, every snapping twig or rustling leaf sending a jolt of fear through us. As dawn began to lighten the sky, we finally stumbled upon a dirt road. Exhausted, soaked, and shaken, we followed it, hoping it would lead us back to civilization. "What are we going to do?" Hanson asked as we walked. "No one's going to believe us." I pulled the metallic scale I had found earlier from my pocket, turning it over in my hand. "Maybe not. But we can't ignore this. Those things, whatever they are, they're not going to stay in the woods forever. We need to find a way to stop them." Hanson nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'm with you, Mr. Reeves, whatever it takes." As we continued down the road, the weight of what lay ahead settled over me. This was no longer just about protecting myself or my home. There was something ancient and malevolent lurking in these woods, something that threatened not just the nearby towns but potentially the entire world. The hunt had begun, but whether we were the hunters or the hunted remained to be seen. The next few weeks passed in a blur of frustration and mounting dread. Despite the evidence we had gathered, the claw marks, the strange tracks, the testimony of those who had seen the aftermath at my cabin, the authorities remained skeptical. The official explanation was that it had been a bear attack, albeit an unusually aggressive one. Hansen and I knew better. We had seen the truth with our own eyes, had felt the otherworldly malevolence of those creatures. But our words fell on deaf ears. I couldn't return to my cabin. It no longer felt like home, tainted as it was by the memory of that terrible night. Instead, I took up residence in a small apartment in Millbrook. Hansen, true to his word, stuck by me. He had taken a leave of absence from the sheriff's department, dedicating himself fully to our cause. We spent our days researching, digging through old town records and native legends, looking for any clue that might help us understand what we were dealing with. The metallic scale I had found became our most tangible piece of evidence. We had it analyzed, but the results only deepened the mystery. The material was unlike anything known to science, lightweight yet incredibly strong, with properties that defied conventional understanding. At night we would venture into the woods, armed and alert, hoping to gather more evidence, but the creatures remained elusive. We would find signs of their passage, more of those strange tracks, trees scarred by impossible claws, but never the creatures themselves. It was during one of these night excursions, about a month after our initial encounter, that everything changed. We were deeper in the woods than we had ever gone before, following a series of tracks that seemed fresher than usual. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual nighttime sounds muted as if the very woods were holding their breath. Suddenly Hansen grabbed my arm, pointing silently ahead. There, in a small clearing, was one of the creatures. It was hunched over something, its back to us. Even from a distance I could see the unnatural pallor of its skin, the way its two long limbs bent at odd angles. We crouched behind a fallen log, hardly daring to breathe. This was our chance, our opportunity to gather undeniable proof of the creature's existence. Slowly, carefully, I raised my camera. But just as I was about to take the picture, the creature turned, its black eyes fixed on us, and in that moment I felt a presence in my mind. Alien thoughts, incomprehensible and terrifying, flooded my consciousness. Images flashed before my eyes. Vast cyclopean cities that had never known human feet, beings of unimaginable power moving between the stars, and always, always those black, bottomless eyes watching, waiting. I heard Hansen gasp beside me, and I knew he was experiencing the same vision. The creature took a step towards us, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision ended. The creature was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. Hansen and I looked at each other, shaken to our cores. "Did you?" Hansen began, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to find words to describe what we had just experienced. It wasn't just that we had seen the creature. We had connected with it, had glimpsed the alien intelligence behind those terrible eyes. And in doing so, we had touched upon a truth far more terrifying than we could have imagined. These creatures, these things that haunted the woods, they weren't just some unknown animal species. They were something else entirely. Visitors from beyond our world, perhaps even beyond our universe. And they had been here, hidden in the dark places of the earth, for far longer than humans had walked these lands. As we made our way back to town, shaken and silent, I knew that everything had changed. We were no longer simply trying to prove the existence of an unknown creature. We were standing on the precipice of a revelation that could shake the very foundations of human understanding. But with this new knowledge came new dangers. If these creatures were as ancient and powerful as our vision suggested, how could we hope to stop them? And more pressingly, now that we knew the truth, would they let us live to reveal it? As we reached the edge of town, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I made a decision. We couldn't keep this to ourselves any longer. The risk was too great, the stakes too high. It was time to take our story to the world, consequences be damned. Little did I know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change our lives forever, but potentially alter the course of human history. The hunt had taken on a new dimension, and the line between hunter and hunted had never been more blurred. As we walked into town, the weight of our new knowledge heavy upon us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Somewhere out there, in the depths of the forest or perhaps in places beyond human comprehension, those black eyes were fixed upon us, waiting, planning. The real battle, I realized, was only just beginning,